The house had been empty for 3 months when the lawyers finally finished sorting through grandmother's estate. Standing on the wraparound porch with the heavy brass key in my hand, I felt the weight of inheriting something I'd never expected to own. The Victorian mansion had been in our family for over a century, but I'd always assumed it would go to my mother or one of my aunts. Instead, grandmother had left it specifically to me, along with a handwritten note that simply said, "Clara understands the importance of preserving family history." I wasn't sure what she meant by that. At 26, I was a graduate student in art history, barely scraping by on my research stipend, with no experience managing property, and certainly no money for the extensive renovations the old house clearly needed. The wraparound porch sagged in places, the paint was peeling from the ornate trim, and several of the gingerbread details were missing entirely. But it was beautiful in the way that only old houses can be, full of character and stories, with tall windows that caught the afternoon light and cast intricate shadows across the hardwood floors. Grandmother had lived here alone for the last 15 years of her life, ever since grandfather passed away, and walking through the rooms felt like stepping back in time. The furniture was still arranged exactly as it had been during my childhood visits. The same faded floral wallpaper, the same heavy curtains, the same collection of porcelain figurines that had fascinated and terrified me as a little girl. Everything was covered in a thin layer of dust, but otherwise the house felt frozen in time, as if grandmother had just stepped out for groceries and would return at any moment. My mother had offered to help me go through grandmother's belongings, but I'd declined. There was something about doing this alone that felt right, like a private conversation with a woman who'd always been slightly mysterious to me. Grandmother had been kind but reserved during my childhood, never sharing much about her past or her feelings. Maybe sorting through her possessions would help me understand who she'd really been. I started with the obvious things: clothing for donation, old medications for disposal, personal papers that might be important for settling the estate. But as I worked my way through the house, I began to notice things that didn't quite make sense. The basement door was secured, with an unusually heavy lock, much more substantial than any other lock in the house. Several rooms had furniture pushed against walls in ways that seemed deliberately concealing, as if something behind them was meant to stay hidden. Most puzzling was grandmother's bedroom, which contained a massive oak wardrobe that seemed too large for the space. When I tried to move it to clean behind it, I discovered it was somehow attached to the wall. Not just heavy, actually fastened in place with brackets that had been painted over so many times they were barely visible. The basement itself was typical for a house this age. Stone walls, low ceiling, containing the usual collection of stored furniture, holiday decorations, and forgotten household items. But something about the layout bothered me. Having studied architecture as part of my art history program, I developed a good sense of spatial relationships, and the basement seemed smaller than it should be given the footprint of the house above. I spent an afternoon measuring and sketching, comparing the basement dimensions to my rough estimates of the first floor layout. Unless I was miscalculating significantly, there was approximately 8 by 10 feet of space that should exist but didn't seem to be accessible from anywhere I could find. The discovery came by accident 3 days later while I was moving boxes of Christmas decorations. One of the boxes caught on something protruding from the stone wall. A metal handle, painted black to match the mortar, almost invisible unless you were looking for it. When I pulled on the handle, a section of the wall swung inward like a door, revealing a hidden room that explained the missing square footage. The space beyond was finished differently from the rest of the basement. Wood paneling instead of exposed stone, electric lighting, and climate control that was still functioning. But what made my blood run cold wasn't the construction quality, it was what the room contained. The walls were covered with photographs. Hundreds of them, dating back decades, showing people I didn't recognize in what appeared to be various states of distress. Some were clearly surveillance photos taken without the subject's knowledge. Others showed people who appeared to be unconscious or restrained. All of them were organized with the systematic precision of someone conducting research. Below the photographs were filing cabinets filled with detailed notes written in grandmother's careful handwriting. Names, addresses, daily routines, personal information about dozens of individuals. The files read like the work of a private investigator, but the level of detail and the nature of some of the observations suggested something far more sinister. At the center of the room was a desk with multiple computer monitors, professional-grade camera equipment, and communication devices I didn't recognize. Everything was clean, organized, and clearly had been in regular use until very recently. A calendar on the desk showed appointments and activities marked up until the week before grandmother's death. I found myself sitting on the floor of that hidden room, trying to process what I was seeing. My grandmother, the woman who'd made cookies for church bake sales and knitted Afghans for every new baby in the family, had apparently been running some kind of surveillance operation from her basement. The evidence suggested she'd been monitoring people, photographing them without consent, and maintaining detailed records of their private lives. But as I examined the files more carefully, I began to notice patterns that complicated my initial horror. The people being monitored weren't random victims. According to the documentation, they were individuals with histories of domestic violence, sexual assault, or other serious crimes, who'd avoided prosecution or received minimal sentences. Grandmother's notes tracked their behavior, their new relationships, their interactions with potential victims. One file belonged to Marcus Webb, a man who'd been accused of rape by 3 different women but never convicted due to lack of evidence or prosecutorial failures. Grandmother's surveillance had documented him following women from bars, attempting to isolate potential victims, and displaying the same predatory behavior patterns that had characterized his previous accusations. Her notes included dates, times, locations, and detailed behavioral observations that read like evidence prepared for law enforcement. Another file tracked Jennifer Morrison, a woman who'd been investigated for child abuse but had retained custody of her children due to insufficient evidence. Grandmother's documentation showed ongoing signs of abuse, unexplained injuries on the children, erratic behavior patterns, and incidents that suggested the abuse was continuing and escalating. The more files I read, the clearer the pattern became. Grandmother hadn't been stalking innocent people. She'd been conducting surveillance on individuals who she believed were dangerous, but who'd escaped legal consequences for their actions. The photographs that had initially looked sinister were actually evidence of ongoing criminal behavior, domestic violence incidents, drug transactions, child endangerment situations. At the bottom of one filing cabinet, I found a leather journal that explained everything. Grandmother's own story, written in her careful script, describing how she'd become involved in what she called, quote, justice work. It had started 40 years ago when her younger sister Anne had been murdered by her ex-husband. Despite clear evidence of escalating domestic violence and multiple police reports, the legal system had failed to protect Anne. Her ex-husband had served only 8 years for the murder and had been released to resume his life while Anne's family struggled with permanent loss. The system failed my sister, grandmother had written. It fails women and children every day, allowing dangerous people to walk free while their victims live in fear or lose their lives entirely. If the system won't protect innocent people, then someone else must. Grandmother had spent the years following Anne's death learning surveillance techniques, photography, evidence gathering, and legal procedures. She'd connected with other women who'd lost family members to preventable violence, and together they'd created an informal network dedicated to monitoring dangerous individuals who'd escaped justice through legal technicalities, prosecutorial failures, or systemic bias. The group called themselves Watchers, and they operated with sophisticated protocols for identifying targets, gathering evidence, and coordinating with law enforcement agencies when they uncovered actionable information. They weren't vigilantes taking justice into their own hands. They were filling gaps in a system that often failed to protect vulnerable people from repeat offenders. "We watch so that others might be warned," read one entry. "We document so that patterns become clear. We remember so that victims are not forgotten." The files in grandmother's basement represented decades of meticulous work documenting criminal behavior that might otherwise have gone unnoticed. Her surveillance had led to the arrests of 7 individuals for crimes ranging from domestic violence to child trafficking. Her evidence had helped convict 12 others whose cases might have failed without the documentation she provided. But the personal cost had been enormous. Grandmother had lived a double life for 40 years, maintaining the facade of a conventional elderly woman, while actually operating as an underground investigator targeting dangerous criminals. She'd never remarried after grandfather's death, never developed close friendships, never traveled or pursued hobbies that might interfere with her surveillance work. The final entries in her journal, written just weeks before her death, revealed that she'd been trying to find someone to continue the work. The other original watchers had died or become too elderly to maintain surveillance activities, and grandmother was facing the reality that decades of accumulated knowledge and evidence might be lost. Clara has the right instincts and the necessary skills, she'd written about me. Her academic training in research and analysis would serve her well in this work. More importantly, she understands that preserving history means more than just studying the past. It means protecting the future. I sat in that hidden room for hours, reading through files and trying to understand what grandmother was asking of me. She'd left me the house not just as an inheritance, but as a responsibility. The surveillance operation, the evidence files, the network of contacts, all of it was now mine to continue or abandon. The weight of the decision was overwhelming. I was a graduate student, not a private investigator. I had no experience with surveillance, no training in evidence gathering, no connections to law enforcement agencies. The idea of taking on grandmother's work felt impossible. But as I read through case files detailing the people grandmother had been monitoring, I began to understand the stakes involved. Marcus Webb was still active, still targeting vulnerable women, still evading prosecution despite a clear pattern of predatory behavior. Jennifer Morrison's children were still in danger, still showing signs of ongoing abuse that Child Protective Services had failed to address. If I walked away from grandmother's work, these people would continue to harm others. If I tried to continue it without the knowledge and skills grandmother had developed over decades, I might make dangerous mistakes that could put innocent people at risk. The solution came to me gradually as I explored more of the house and found additional evidence of grandmother's activities. Hidden throughout the Victorian mansion were communication devices, secure phone lines, and contacts for a network of people who'd been working with her for years. I wasn't inheriting this responsibility alone. I was inheriting a place in an established organization with resources and support systems. 3 days after discovering the hidden room, I called the number listed in grandmother's journal as her primary contact. The woman who answered, Margaret Chen, had been expecting my call. "Eleanor told us about you," Margaret said when I explained who I was. "She hoped you'd be willing to continue her work, but she wanted you to make that decision freely, with full knowledge of what it would involve." Margaret invited me to meet with the surviving members of grandmother's network, 6 women ranging in age from 45 to 78, all of whom had lost family members to preventable violence and had spent years working to fill gaps in the justice system. "We're not vigilantes," Margaret explained during our first meeting. "We don't take justice into our own hands or operate outside the law. We gather information that law enforcement agencies can use to build cases against dangerous individuals who might otherwise continue harming people." "But isn't this surveillance illegal?" "Most of our surveillance takes place in public spaces where people have no expectation of privacy," said Janet Rodriguez, a woman whose daughter had been killed by a stalker the police had failed to stop. "We photograph behavior that anyone could observe. We just do it systematically and document it carefully. When we observe criminal activity, we report it to appropriate authorities," added Linda Walsh, whose sister had been murdered by an abusive partner. "When we identify patterns of behavior that suggest someone is likely to commit crimes, we warn potential victims and provide information to law enforcement agencies." The network operated with strict ethical guidelines and legal oversight. They worked with sympathetic lawyers, forensic specialists, and law enforcement contacts who understood the limitations of official investigations and appreciated having access to information that might otherwise be unavailable. "Eleanor was one of our most skilled operatives," Margaret told me. "She had a gift for identifying dangerous individuals and predicting their behavior patterns. But more than that, she understood the importance of maintaining detailed records that could be used in legal proceedings." Over the following weeks, I learned more about the network's operations and my grandmother's role within it. The Victorian house hadn't just been her home. It had been a regional headquarters for surveillance activities covering 3 states. The hidden room in the basement was connected to similar facilities in other cities, all of them operated by women who'd been failed by traditional justice systems. The decision to join the network wasn't one I made lightly. It would mean fundamentally changing my life, abandoning my graduate studies, and taking on responsibilities that could be dangerous and emotionally exhausting. But it would also mean using my research skills and analytical training to help protect people who had nowhere else to turn. More importantly, it would mean honoring the legacy of a grandmother I was only beginning to understand. Eleanor had spent 40 years of her life fighting for justice in ways that most people never knew about. She'd sacrificed personal relationships, financial security, and conventional happiness to make sure that dangerous people didn't slip through cracks in the system. 6 months later, I was living permanently in the Victorian house, having converted the upper floors into living space while maintaining the surveillance operations in the basement. The hidden room had been expanded and updated with modern equipment, and I'd learned to use the cameras, communication devices, and analysis software that were essential tools of the trade. My first case involved monitoring David Patterson, a man who'd been released from prison after serving only 4 years for aggravated assault against his ex-wife. Despite a restraining order, Patterson had been spotted near his ex-wife's workplace and his children's school, behavior that suggested he was planning to violate the order and potentially escalate to more serious violence. Working with the network's legal contacts, I documented Patterson's violations of the restraining order and provided evidence that led to his arrest before he could harm his family. It was a small victory, but it proved that the surveillance work could make a real difference in protecting innocent people. As I settled into my new role, I began to understand why grandmother had chosen me for this inheritance. My academic training in research and analysis was perfect preparation for investigating complex cases and identifying behavioral patterns. My lack of family obligations meant I could dedicate the time and energy necessary for surveillance work. Most importantly, my outsider status in the conventional world made me invisible in ways that were valuable for observing people without being noticed. The Victorian house that had once seemed like an overwhelming responsibility became a sanctuary and a command center. The hidden room that had initially horrified me became the place where I did the most meaningful work of my life. The grandmother I'd thought I knew became a mentor whose wisdom guided every decision I made about protecting vulnerable people from those who would harm them. I still think about the moment I first found that hidden room, the shock of discovering that everything I thought I knew about my family was incomplete. But now I understand that the best inheritances aren't always the ones we expect. Sometimes we inherit not just property or money, but purpose. Sometimes we inherit not just history, but the responsibility to shape the future. Grandmother left me more than a Victorian house. She left me a calling, a community, and the knowledge that ordinary people can do extraordinary things when they're willing to stand between the innocent and those who would harm them. The house holds our family's secrets, but it also holds our family's strength. The watchers continue to watch, the work continues. And somewhere people are safer because someone decided that justice delayed doesn't have to mean justice denied, as long as there are those willing to fill the gaps where systems fail. The Victorian house stands as a monument to that principle, its hidden room, a reminder that the most important work is often the work no one sees, done by people no one remembers, protecting those who have nowhere else to turn. This is my inheritance, and I accept it gladly. This is my inheritance, and I accept it gladly. The first year was the hardest. Learning surveillance techniques while maintaining the facade of a normal life required skills I'd never developed as an academic. I had to master everything from long-range photography to digital security protocols, all while pretending to be a grieving granddaughter slowly renovating her inherited Victorian home. Margaret Chen became my primary mentor, teaching me the subtle art of observing without being observed. She'd been doing this work for 23 years, ever since her teenage son was killed by a drunk driver who'd had 7 previous arrests but had never served significant jail time due to legal technicalities and family connections. The key is patience, Margaret told me during one of our training sessions in the hidden basement room. Most people make the mistake of thinking surveillance is about dramatic confrontations or movie-style chases. In reality, it's about developing patterns, understanding routines, and waiting for the right moment to document behavior that reveals someone's true nature. She taught me to think like a researcher, which came naturally given my academic background. Each target became a case study in human behavior, with detailed files tracking everything from daily routines to psychological triggers. The Victorian house's basement became a sophisticated data center, with computer systems that could cross-reference information from multiple sources and identify patterns that might not be obvious to individual investigators. My second case proved more challenging than David Patterson had been. Rebecca Holloway was a woman who'd been investigated for elder abuse at 3 different nursing facilities, but had never been prosecuted due to lack of witnesses and her skill at manipulating supervisors and regulatory agencies. She'd recently taken a position at Sunrise Manor just 20 minutes from my house, where several families had begun expressing concerns about the care their relatives were receiving. Unlike Patterson, whose violations of his restraining order were relatively straightforward to document, Holloway's abuse was subtle and psychological. She targeted patients with dementia or other cognitive impairments who couldn't reliably report mistreatment. Her methods involved withholding medication, verbal intimidation, and creating situations where vulnerable elderly people felt helpless and afraid. This kind of case requires long-term observation and multiple forms of evidence, explained Linda Walsh, who specialized in institutional abuse cases. We need to document patterns of behavior, not just individual incidents. And we need to be extremely careful about protecting the victims while we gather evidence. I spent 3 months learning the routines at Sunrise Manor, identifying the times and locations where Holloway was most likely to engage in abusive behavior. The Victorian house's proximity to the facility was perfect for monitoring her movements, and the sophisticated camera equipment grandmother had installed allowed me to document incidents from a distance. The breakthrough came when I managed to place audio recording devices in common areas of the nursing home during a family visitation day. The recordings revealed Holloway's pattern of threatening patients when she thought no one was listening, using their cognitive impairments against them by telling them no one would believe their complaints. "You're crazy, remember?" I heard her tell one elderly man with early-stage dementia. "Everyone knows you can't tell the difference between what's real and what's in your head. So even if you try to tell someone I'm hurting you, they'll just think it's another one of your episodes." The audio evidence, combined with video documentation of her withholding medication and photographs showing unexplained bruises on several patients, provided enough evidence for law enforcement to build a case. Holloway was arrested and eventually convicted of elder abuse, receiving a 10-year sentence and being permanently banned from working in healthcare. But the personal cost of the investigation was higher than I'd anticipated. Spending months documenting abuse while being unable to immediately stop it created a psychological burden I hadn't been prepared for. Watching vulnerable people suffer while gathering evidence that would eventually help them required a level of emotional detachment that went against every instinct I had. "This is the hardest part of the work," Janet Rodriguez told me after I confided my struggles to the network. "You have to learn to balance immediate compassion with long-term justice. If we intervene too early, before we have sufficient evidence, dangerous people walk free and often become more careful about hiding their crimes. But watching people get hurt while you're taking photographs feels like complicity. I understand. We all struggle with that balance." Janet's voice was gentle but firm. "But remember that without our documentation, Rebecca Holloway would have continued abusing elderly patients for years or even decades. The temporary suffering we documented prevented much more extensive future suffering." The network provided psychological support resources that grandmother had apparently used throughout her 40 years of surveillance work. Regular debriefing sessions with licensed therapists who understood the unique stresses of undercover justice work. Peer support groups with other watchers who'd faced similar moral dilemmas. Protocols for taking breaks from active surveillance when the emotional toll became too great. "Eleanor struggled with the same issues you're facing," Margaret revealed during one of our conversations. She almost quit the network several times during her first few years because she couldn't reconcile watching harm occur with her desire to help people immediately. What changed her mind? She realized that the work we do prevents more harm than it documents. Every person we help convict is someone who can't hurt additional victims. Every pattern we identify is information that can help protect future targets." Margaret paused. "Your grandmother saved dozens of lives over the course of her career. The fact that she had to document some suffering in order to prevent much greater suffering was a trade-off she learned to live with. As I entered my second year of surveillance work, I began to understand the complex ethical framework that guided the Watchers' operations. We weren't simply documenting criminal behavior. We were building cases that the traditional justice system couldn't or wouldn't build on its own. Our work filled gaps created by prosecutorial reluctance, evidentiary standards, and systemic biases that allowed dangerous people to escape consequences. The Victorian house became more than just my home and headquarters. It became a sanctuary for other network members who needed safe places to conduct sensitive operations. The hidden basement room was expanded to include secure communication facilities, evidence storage, and analysis equipment that served watchers throughout the region. Linda Walsh moved into one of the upper floor bedrooms after her own home was compromised during an investigation into a human trafficking ring. Janet Rodriguez used the house's secure communication systems to coordinate with law enforcement contacts when her own safety was threatened by a domestic abuser she'd been monitoring. Eleanor designed this place to be a fortress, Margaret explained, as we installed additional security measures. She understood that the work we do makes us targets for the people we investigate. The house isn't just a base of operations, it's a refuge for anyone in the network who needs protection. Living with other watchers taught me more about the personal sacrifices the work required. Linda had never married because her surveillance activities made normal relationships impossible. Janet's adult children rarely visited because they couldn't understand why she'd chosen such a dangerous and emotionally demanding lifestyle. Margaret's health was deteriorating from years of stress and irregular schedules, but she couldn't bring herself to retire while dangerous people remained free. We give up conventional lives so that other people can live conventional lives safely, Linda said one evening as we reviewed case files in the basement. It's not a choice most people would make, but it's the choice that makes sense for those of us who've seen what happens when evil people are allowed to operate without oversight. My third major case brought me face to face with the network's most dangerous adversary, someone who knew about our operations and was actively working to expose and neutralize us. Thomas Morrison was a former police detective who'd been dismissed from 3 different departments for evidence tampering and witness intimidation. He'd apparently discovered the existence of the Watchers and was using his law enforcement connections to identify and harass network members. Morrison is different from our usual targets, Margaret warned during an emergency meeting at the Victorian house. He has professional training in surveillance and counter-surveillance techniques. He understands how we operate, and he's been studying our methods for months. The evidence suggested that Morrison had identified at least 6 network members across 3 states and was building dossiers on their activities. His apparent goal was to expose the Watchers to law enforcement agencies and media outlets as a vigilante organization operating outside legal boundaries. He's been photographing us conducting surveillance, documenting our communication patterns, and trying to identify our law enforcement contacts, Janet reported. If he succeeds in exposing the network, we'll lose decades of accumulated intelligence and dozens of active investigations will be compromised. More immediately dangerous was Morrison's apparent willingness to use violence against network members who couldn't be neutralized through legal channels. 2 Watchers in other states had been assaulted in incidents that appeared random but followed patterns suggesting systematic targeting. This is exactly the kind of situation Eleanor prepared for, Margaret said as we reviewed security protocols. The house has defensive capabilities that go beyond standard home security systems. I discovered that grandmother had spent years turning the Victorian mansion into something resembling a fortress. The basement held not just surveillance equipment but also emergency supplies, secure communication bunkers, and defensive positions that could be used if the house came under attack. The elaborate gingerbread trim wasn't just decorative. It concealed cameras, motion sensors, and other security devices that provided complete coverage of the property. Eleanor always said that if you're going to fight monsters, you need to be prepared for the monsters to fight back, Linda explained as she showed me weapons caches hidden throughout the house. The network's existence depends on members being able to protect themselves and each other when the work gets dangerous. The confrontation with Morrison came sooner than we'd expected. 3 weeks after learning about his investigation into our activities, I returned home from a routine surveillance operation to find evidence that someone had been inside the house. Nothing was missing, but small details were wrong. Books moved slightly, furniture positioned differently, computer equipment that showed signs of recent access. "He's been here," Margaret confirmed after reviewing the security footage. "Professional job. He knew how to avoid most of the cameras and disable the alarms temporarily. But he wasn't perfect. We have enough footage to identify him definitively." More concerning was what Morrison had left behind. Photographs of me conducting surveillance, copies of case files he'd somehow accessed, and a handwritten note that made his intentions clear. "Stop the vigilante activities or face the consequences. You have 1 week to cease operations and destroy all evidence, or I'll expose the entire network to federal investigators." The network's response was swift and decisive. Within hours, every watcher in the region had been alerted to Morrison's threat. Law enforcement contacts who'd been working with us for years were briefed on the situation. Legal specialists began preparing defensive strategies in case Morrison followed through on his threats. But most importantly, the network did what it did best. It began gathering evidence about Morrison's own criminal activities. His history of evidence tampering and witness intimidation had been poorly documented because his police colleagues had protected him. Now, with the full resources of the Watcher Network focused on his behavior, patterns emerged that painted a picture of systematic corruption spanning decades. "Morrison's been selling information to criminal organizations for at least 15 years, reported Sarah Kim, a network member who specialized in financial crimes. "He's taken money from drug dealers, human traffickers, and domestic abusers in exchange for advance warning about investigations and evidence tampering that helped them avoid prosecution. He's also been running his own protection racket," added Maria Santos, who'd been investigating Morrison's activities in another state. "Criminals pay him to harass witnesses, intimidate victims, and disrupt legal proceedings. His threat against us isn't about law and order. It's about protecting his own criminal enterprise." The evidence we gathered about Morrison's activities was extensive and damning. Financial records showing payments from known criminals. Audio recordings of him offering to tamper with evidence in exchange for money. Video documentation of him intimidating witnesses and threatening victims who were planning to testify against his clients. But Morrison wasn't waiting for us to build a case against him. 3 days before his deadline, he attempted to break into the Victorian house, apparently planning to steal or destroy evidence that could be used against him. Grandmother's security systems detected his approach long before he reached the house, giving us time to coordinate with law enforcement contacts who'd agreed to help protect the network. The arrest happened in my front yard, with Morrison caught red-handed carrying burglary tools and weapons that suggested he'd been planning to use violence if necessary. The evidence we'd gathered about his criminal activities provided more than enough justification for federal charges that would keep him in prison for decades. One of the advantages of fighting corruption is that corrupt people usually have extensive criminal histories, Margaret observed as we watched Morrison being led away in handcuffs. "They can't expose us without exposing themselves, and we have more resources for gathering evidence than they expect." The Morrison case marked a turning point in my understanding of the network's work and my role within it. We weren't just documenting criminal behavior. We were actively defending ourselves and each other against people who wanted to eliminate oversight of their activities. The Victorian house wasn't just a surveillance headquarters. It was a tactical base for operations that sometimes required military-level planning and coordination. But the case also reinforced the importance of the network's ethical guidelines and legal constraints. Everything we'd done to neutralize Morrison's threat had been accomplished through evidence gathering and coordination with legitimate law enforcement agencies. We defended ourselves without becoming the vigilantes Morrison had accused us of being. "This is why Eleanor chose you," Margaret told me as we debriefed the operation. "She knew you'd understand the difference between justice and revenge, between necessary force and excessive violence. The network needs people who can make difficult decisions without losing sight of the principles that guide our work." As I entered my 3rd year of surveillance operations, I realized that I'd found not just a career but a calling that used every aspect of my training and personality. The research skills I developed in graduate school were perfect for analyzing criminal behavior patterns. The Victorian house provided the perfect base for operations that required both security and accessibility. Most importantly, the network had become a family united by shared purpose and mutual protection. The hidden room in the basement had expanded into a sophisticated intelligence center that served watchers across multiple states. The Victorian house hosted training programs for new network members, coordination meetings for complex operations, and secure communication sessions with law enforcement contacts who couldn't risk being seen with us publicly. But I never forgot that the work came with personal costs that couldn't be measured in cases solved or lives saved. I'd given up the academic career I'd planned, the normal social life I'd once taken for granted, and the sense of safety that comes from living an ordinary existence. Like grandmother and the other watchers, I'd chosen to sacrifice personal happiness for the greater good of protecting innocent people from those who would harm them. The sacrifice felt worthwhile every time I received updates about the people we'd helped protect. Rebecca Holloway's nursing home victims were receiving proper care and therapy to help them recover from the abuse they'd suffered. David Patterson was serving a 10-year sentence that would keep his family safe for the foreseeable future. Thomas Morrison's criminal network had been dismantled, freeing dozens of witnesses and victims from intimidation and threats. "Grandmother was right about you," I said to her photograph, which now sat on the desk in the hidden basement room. "I do understand the importance of preserving family history. But I also understand that sometimes preserving history means making sure there's a future worth preserving." The Victorian house stands as a monument to that principle. Its hidden spaces filled with evidence of humanity's capacity for both evil and justice. The watchers continue to watch, the work continues to matter, and somewhere people are sleeping safely, because someone decided that the gaps in official justice systems didn't have to remain unfilled. This is my inheritance, and I've learned to carry it with pride. This is my inheritance, and I've learned to carry it with pride. By my 4th year in the house, I'd become what Margaret called a full operative, someone capable of running complex investigations independently while training newer network members. The Victorian mansion had become a regional hub for the watchers, with secure communication lines connecting us to sister houses in 12 other cities. But success brought new challenges I hadn't anticipated. The more effective our operations became, the more attention we attracted from people who had reasons to want our work stopped. Not just corrupt individuals like Thomas Morrison, but organized criminal enterprises that saw our surveillance activities as threats to their business operations. The first sign of escalation came through Drive. Sarah Martinez, a forensic psychiatrist who'd been providing psychological profiles for our investigations. She called me at 3 a.m, her voice tight with controlled panic. "Clara, they know about me. Someone broke into my office and stole files related to our cases. But they didn't take anything else. No drugs, no expensive equipment, nothing a normal burglar would want." I was instantly alert, reaching for the emergency protocols grandmother had established for compromised network members. "Where are you now?" "Safe house on the east side. Margaret's people picked me up 2 hours ago." Sarah's breathing was uneven, suggesting she was more shaken than she wanted to admit. "But Clara, this isn't random. They knew exactly which files to target. Someone with detailed knowledge of our operations told them what to look for." The possibility of a leak within the network was something we'd always feared but never directly confronted. The watchers operated on trust and mutual vulnerability. We had to share sensitive information to coordinate effectively. But that same openness made us susceptible to infiltration by hostile forces. "Margaret's calling an emergency meeting for tomorrow night," Sarah continued. "All regional operatives. We need to figure out how our security was compromised and who might have access to operational details." The meeting was held in the Victorian house's basement, now expanded to include a secure conference room that could accommodate 12 people comfortably. Representatives from 6 states gathered around the oak table grandmother had used for similar crisis management sessions over the decades. "The breach is definitely internal," reported Janet Rodriguez, who'd been analyzing communication patterns for signs of unauthorized access. "Someone with high-level clearance has been feeding information to outside parties for at least 6 months." "Do we have suspects?" asked Linda Walsh. Margaret spread photographs across the table, surveillance images of 3 women I recognized as network members from other regions. These are the only people with access to the specific files that were stolen from Sarah's office. All 3 joined the network within the past 2 years. All 3 have been involved in cases that later experienced unusual complications. I studied the photographs, trying to reconcile the idea that fellow watchers might be working against us. Patricia Blake from Ohio, who joined after her sister was murdered by a stalker. Jennifer Chen from Colorado, recruited after her daughter was killed by a drunk driver. Maria Lopez from Texas, whose mother had died in a nursing home under suspicious circumstances. What kind of complications? I asked. Targets who seemed to know they were being watched, Janet replied. Evidence that disappeared before we could document it. Witnesses who changed their stories or refused to cooperate with investigations. The pattern suggests someone is warning our targets about surveillance activities, Margaret added. But it's sophisticated. They're not stopping all our operations, just enough to create problems without making the sabotage obvious. The investigation into our internal security breach revealed the complex challenges of maintaining an organization that operated outside normal institutional boundaries. We had extensive protocols for vetting new members, but determined infiltrators could construct false backgrounds that would pass initial screening. We had secure communication systems, but they were only as secure as the people using them. More troubling was the discovery that our infiltrator wasn't working for criminal organizations trying to protect themselves from surveillance. Intelligence indicated that Patricia Blake was actually an operative for a private security firm that specialized in corporate espionage and political opposition research. Blake's real employer is Consolidated Risk Management, explained Tom Chen, Margaret's contact in federal law enforcement. They provide, quote, intelligence services to clients who want information about activists, journalists, and other potential threats to their interests. What would a corporate security firm want with our operations? Control, Tom said grimly. Our network has become influential enough to affect criminal prosecutions and civil litigation involving wealthy defendants. Blake's job was to gather intelligence that could be used to neutralize our effectiveness when we investigate cases involving CRM's clients. The revelation that we'd become targets of corporate espionage marked another evolution in my understanding of the work we did. The Watchers weren't just fighting individual criminals. We were challenging systems of power that allowed wealthy and connected people to escape consequences for their actions. This is exactly what Eleanor warned would happen, Margaret told me, as we planned our response to the Blake situation. She always said that if the network became too successful, we'd face organized opposition from people with resources and institutional connections. What did she recommend for handling that kind of threat? Adaptation and expansion. We become more sophisticated in our operations, more careful about security, and more strategic about choosing battles we can win. Margaret pulled out a map showing Watcher operations across the country. We also develop capabilities that make us too valuable to eliminate completely. The Blake investigation led to a comprehensive review of network security protocols and operational procedures. New vetting processes that included psychological evaluation and extended observation periods. Enhanced communication encryption that even government agencies would have difficulty breaking. Compartmentalization of information so that compromising one operative couldn't expose entire operations. But the most significant change was strategic. The network began accepting contracts from legitimate organizations that needed investigative services but couldn't use traditional law enforcement or private detective agencies. Insurance companies investigating fraudulent claims. Law firms building cases against dangerous individuals. Civil rights organizations documenting systematic abuse. If we're going to be targeted by corporate interests anyway, we might as well develop corporate clients who can provide legal protection and financial resources, Margaret explained. The key is choosing clients whose goals align with our mission of protecting innocent people from those who would harm them. My role evolved from pure surveillance operative to what Margaret called a case coordinator, someone who managed complex investigations involving multiple operatives and diverse evidence sources. The Victorian house became a regional command center where information from dozens of sources was analyzed, cross-referenced, and developed into actionable intelligence. The work was more intellectually demanding than anything I'd done in graduate school, requiring skills in psychology, criminal justice, data analysis, and strategic planning. But it was also more personally fulfilling than academic research had ever been, because every successful investigation resulted in real people being protected from real dangers. One case from my 5th year illustrated the complexity of our evolved operations. Rebecca Torres was a family court judge who'd been making custody decisions that consistently favored abusive parents over protective ones. Traditional oversight mechanisms had failed to address her pattern of dangerous rulings because she was politically connected and skilled at legal manipulation. 16 children have been placed in homes where they've subsequently been abused or killed, reported Dr. Amanda Walsh, a child psychologist who'd been tracking Torres's decisions. The pattern is clear, but proving judicial misconduct is extremely difficult because judges have broad discretion in custody cases. Our investigation revealed that Torres was receiving financial incentives from a legal services organization that represented abusive parents. The payments were disguised as speaking fees and consulting contracts, but they correlated perfectly with her pattern of favorable rulings for documented abusers. More disturbing was the discovery that Torres was part of a network of corrupt family court officials who were systematically placing children with abusive parents in exchange for various forms of compensation. The network included judges, court-appointed attorneys, child custody evaluators, and social workers across multiple jurisdictions. This isn't just one corrupt judge, I reported to Margaret during our case review. It's an organized conspiracy that's been operating for at least 8 years. They've developed sophisticated methods for identifying wealthy abusers who are willing to pay for favorable custody decisions. How many children are we talking about? Conservative estimate, over 200 children placed in dangerous situations across 4 states. The numbers made me sick every time I reviewed them. 12 confirmed deaths, dozens of documented abuse cases, and probably many more situations we haven't identified yet. The Torres investigation required coordination with federal law enforcement agencies, state attorney general offices, and child protection organizations. The evidence we gathered led to a federal task force that ultimately resulted in 23 arrests and completely restructured family court procedures in 2 states. But the personal cost of the investigation was higher than any case I'd handled previously. Documenting systematic child abuse while being unable to immediately protect all the victims created a level of psychological trauma that required months of therapy to process. This is the hardest part of advancing in the network, Dr. Sarah Martinez told me during one of our counseling sessions. As you become capable of handling more complex cases, you're exposed to larger-scale horror and systematic evil. The individual victories become more meaningful, but the emotional burden becomes harder to bear. How do the senior operatives handle it? Different ways. Some develop emotional calluses that protect them, but also isolate them from normal relationships. Others burn out and retire early. The healthiest ones learn to focus on the larger patterns. The systems we're changing, the policies we're influencing, the institutional improvements that result from our work. By my 6th year in the Victorian house, I'd learned to think in terms of systematic change rather than individual cases. The network's influence had grown to the point where our investigations regularly led to policy changes, institutional reforms, and legislative actions that protected thousands of people rather than just specific individuals. The house itself had become a symbol of the network's evolution. What had started as grandmother's personal surveillance operation had grown into a regional coordination center that influenced criminal justice policies across multiple states. The hidden basement room had expanded into a sophisticated intelligence facility that rivaled government agencies in its capabilities. But success had also attracted new forms of opposition that required constant vigilance and adaptation. Corporate security firms, like the one that had employed Patricia Blake, were developing counter-surveillance techniques specifically designed to neutralize watcher operations. Criminal organizations were hiring former law enforcement and military personnel to protect their activities from our investigations. Most concerning was the emergence of what intelligence analysts called dark networks, criminal enterprises that had learned to operate with the same level of sophistication and security consciousness that characterized our own activities. These organizations understood that traditional law enforcement agencies had limited resources and legal constraints that could be exploited by sufficiently careful criminals. "We're not just fighting individual bad actors anymore," Margaret observed during one of our strategic planning sessions. "We're fighting criminal organizations that have adapted to our methods and developed countermeasures specifically designed to neutralize our effectiveness." What does that mean for the future of the network? It means we have to keep evolving. The methods that worked for Eleanor's generation aren't sufficient for the challenges we're facing now. We need new capabilities, new partnerships, and new approaches to staying ahead of increasingly sophisticated adversaries. The evolution continued with my appointment as regional coordinator for the southeastern United States, responsible for managing Watcher operations across 7 states and coordinating with federal law enforcement agencies on cases that cross jurisdictional boundaries. The Victorian House became the official headquarters for the region, with secure communication facilities that connected us to network operations around the world. "Eleanor would be proud," Margaret told me during the ceremony that marked my promotion. She always believed that the network would need to grow beyond its original mission to remain effective. "You've helped prove that the Watchers can adapt to new challenges while maintaining the ethical standards and operational effectiveness that made us valuable in the first place." But with increased responsibility came increased personal costs that I was still learning to manage. The demanding schedule of surveillance operations, coordination meetings, and strategic planning left little time for personal relationships or normal social activities. Like grandmother and the other senior Watchers, I was sacrificing conventional happiness for the greater good of protecting innocent people. The sacrifice felt worthwhile when I reviewed the statistics that measured our collective impact. In 6 years of operations, the southeastern region had contributed to the conviction of 127 dangerous individuals, the protection of over 400 potential victims, and the reform of institutional policies that had previously allowed systematic abuse to continue unchecked. "We're not just solving individual cases anymore," I reported to the annual network conference held in the Victorian House. "We're changing the systems that allow dangerous people to operate with impunity. Every successful investigation makes it harder for the next predator to find victims and escape consequences." The work continued to evolve as new threats emerged and new opportunities developed. But the core mission remained the same: watching so that others might be warned, documenting so that patterns became clear, remembering so that victims were not forgotten. The Victorian House stood as a monument to that mission, its hidden spaces filled with evidence of the network's growing influence and capability. Grandmother's surveillance operation had become something she probably never imagined, a professional organization that influenced policy at the highest levels of government, while maintaining the grassroots commitment to protecting individual victims that had motivated the original Watchers. As I prepared for my 7th year in the House, I reflected on the journey that had brought me from a confused graduate student to a regional coordinator responsible for operations that protected thousands of people. The inheritance that had initially seemed overwhelming had become a calling that used every aspect of my training and personality in service of something larger than myself. The hidden room in the basement contained not just surveillance equipment, but also photographs and files documenting hundreds of lives that had been saved, families that had been protected, and dangerous individuals who'd been stopped before they could cause additional harm. Each case represented someone's daughter, mother, child, or loved one who was safer because the network existed. This was my inheritance, and I'd learned to carry it not just with pride, but with the understanding that some responsibilities are too important to be abandoned, no matter how difficult they become. The Watchers would continue to watch, the work would continue to matter, and somewhere people would sleep safely because someone had decided that justice delayed didn't have to mean justice denied. The Victorian House would continue to serve as headquarters for that mission, its elegant exterior hiding the sophisticated operations that had grown from one woman's determination to prevent the kind of tragedy that had destroyed her sister. Grandmother's legacy had become something larger than she'd probably imagined, but it remained true to the principles that had motivated her original decision to fill gaps where official systems failed. The inheritance continued to shape not just my life, but the lives of everyone the network touched. And that, I realized, was exactly what Grandmother had intended when she chose me to preserve not just family history, but family purpose. The inheritance continued to shape not just my life, but the lives of everyone the network touched. And that, I realized, was exactly what grandmother had intended when she chose me to preserve not just family history, but family purpose. The seventh year brought an unexpected challenge that tested everything I'd learned about balancing personal life with network responsibilities. Dr. Michael Santos, a forensic psychologist who'd been consulting with us for 3 years, asked me to dinner, not for a case briefing, but for what he carefully termed personal conversation. I'd been attracted to Michael since our first meeting, drawn to his intelligence, his commitment to protecting vulnerable people, and his ability to understand the psychological complexities of our work without being overwhelmed by them. But I'd never allowed myself to consider a romantic relationship with someone connected to network operations. The personal costs of this work include isolation, I confided to Margaret during one of our regular check-ins. I can't date civilians because I can't explain what I actually do for a living. Dating people connected to the network seems like a security risk and a professional complication. Eleanor struggled with the same dilemma, Margaret replied. She chose complete isolation, never allowing herself personal relationships that might compromise operational security. But she also acknowledged that this choice contributed to the emotional isolation that made the work even harder to bear. What would you recommend? I'd recommend being very careful but not completely closed off to the possibility. Michael has security clearance, he understands the work, and he's proven his discretion over 3 years of collaboration. Margaret paused. More importantly, you need some source of personal happiness and connection that isn't related to surveillance and criminal justice. The work will consume you completely if you let it. The dinner with Michael evolved into a relationship that developed slowly and carefully, with both of us conscious of the unique challenges posed by our professional circumstances. He understood why I couldn't always explain where I was going or what I was working on. I understood why his psychological consulting work sometimes required him to maintain professional distance from cases that affected him personally. I've never dated someone whose job involves regular physical danger, Michael admitted during one of our early conversations about the relationship. It's harder than I expected, knowing that you're sometimes in situations where people might want to hurt you. I've never dated someone who knows what I actually do for a living, I replied. It's liberating but also terrifying, not having to maintain false explanations for why I work such unusual hours or travel to strange places. The relationship provided emotional balance that improved my effectiveness as a network coordinator. Having someone to talk through the psychological challenges of surveillance work helped me process difficult cases without carrying their emotional weight indefinitely. Michael's professional insights also proved valuable for understanding the behavioral patterns of targets and the psychological needs of victims. But the relationship also created new vulnerabilities that required careful management. Michael's connection to me made him a potential target for people who wanted to neutralize my effectiveness or gather intelligence about network operations. The Victorian house's security systems had to be enhanced to protect not just me but also anyone who might be visiting regularly. Dating within the extended network family requires special protocols, explained Linda Walsh, who'd married a former FBI agent she'd met during a joint operation 15 years earlier. Your personal safety and operational security become intertwined in ways that require constant attention and planning. The first test of these security considerations came during my 8th year, when a case involving organized crime figures led to direct threats against network members and their families. Vincent Torino, a casino owner with suspected connections to money laundering and human trafficking, had become aware that the Watchers were investigating his operations. Torino's different from the individual criminals we usually target, warned Agent Patricia Williams, our primary law enforcement contact for organized crime cases. He has resources, connections, and a history of using violence against people who threaten his business interests. Quote, the investigation had begun when several women reported being drugged and sexually assaulted at Torino's casino, with security footage mysteriously disappearing and witnesses being intimidated into changing their stories. Our surveillance had documented a pattern of systematic covering up criminal activity, with casino staff trained to help dispose of evidence and silence victims. This isn't just individual criminal behavior, I reported to the network leadership. Torino's entire organization is designed to facilitate crimes against vulnerable people while preventing any accountability. He's essentially running a criminal enterprise disguised as a legitimate business. But as our investigation progressed, it became clear that Torino had identified several network members and was developing plans to neutralize our effectiveness through intimidation and violence. Security footage from outside my house showed vehicles conducting surveillance. Michael's office was broken into, though nothing was stolen. Other network members reported similar incidents, suggesting organized harassment. They're trying to map our relationships and identify our vulnerabilities, Margaret concluded during an emergency security briefing. Torino's people are professionals, former military and law enforcement with experience in intelligence gathering and tactical operations. The escalation forced us to implement security protocols that transformed daily life in ways I'd never anticipated. The Victorian house went into lockdown mode, with enhanced perimeter security, armed guards, and communication systems that allowed coordination with law enforcement agencies if we came under direct attack. Michael moved into the house temporarily, both for his own protection and to help with security coordination. His psychological training proved valuable for analyzing Torino's likely tactics and predicting how the criminal organization might escalate their harassment campaign. They're using classic intimidation techniques designed to make us feel constantly threatened without actually committing crime serious enough to justify major law enforcement response, Michael observed. The goal is to exhaust our psychological resources and force us to abandon the investigation. What do you recommend? Acceleration. Complete the investigation and provide evidence to law enforcement before they have time to implement more serious threats. Michael's expression was grim. These people will eventually escalate to actual violence if they feel sufficiently threatened. Our best protection is ensuring they're arrested before that escalation occurs. The final phase of the Torino investigation required coordination with federal agencies and state law enforcement that exceeded anything the network had previously attempted. The evidence we'd gathered documenting criminal activity at the casino was combined with financial intelligence from the FBI and witness testimony from victims who'd agreed to cooperate with prosecution. The operation that brought down Torino's organization involved simultaneous raids at 12 locations, arrests of 37 individuals, and seizure of assets worth over $40 million. More importantly, it eliminated a criminal enterprise that had been systematically victimizing vulnerable people for over a decade. This is the kind of case that justifies everything we've built, Margaret told me as we watched news coverage of the arrests. Individual surveillance operations are important, but dismantling entire criminal organizations prevents harm on a scale that makes all the personal costs worthwhile. The Torino case marked another evolution in my understanding of the network's mission and capabilities. We'd moved beyond documenting individual criminal behavior to targeting organized criminal enterprises that required sophisticated investigation techniques and extensive law enforcement coordination. But success came with increased visibility that attracted attention from other criminal organizations and government agencies who were interested in either neutralizing or co-opting our capabilities. The network's influence had grown to the point where we were seen as a significant factor in criminal justice outcomes, which made us both valuable and threatening to various institutional interests. We're approaching a decision point, Margaret explained during a strategic planning session held in the Victorian House's expanded conference facilities. We can maintain our current level of operations and accept the increased risks and scrutiny that comes with our influence. Or we can scale back to smaller operations that attract less attention, but also have less impact. What did Eleanor recommend for this kind of situation? She believed that backing down from effective operations because they attracted opposition was a form of surrender that betrayed the people we were supposed to protect. Margaret pulled out one of grandmother's journals, turning to a passage marked with a ribbon bookmark. She wrote, "If our work makes dangerous people uncomfortable, that's evidence we're doing something right. The goal isn't to avoid attention. It's to use our influence responsibly while maintaining our ability to help people who have nowhere else to turn." The decision to maintain and expand our operations led to the establishment of what became known as the Network Foundation, a legitimate nonprofit organization that provided legal structure and financial resources for our investigative activities. The foundation allowed us to accept grants from government agencies, coordinate officially with law enforcement organizations, and provide services to other nonprofits that needed investigative support. "We're becoming institutionalized," observed Dr. Sarah Martinez during one of our therapy sessions. "The question is whether institutionalization will help us serve our mission more effectively, or whether it will compromise the flexibility and independence that made us effective in the first place." The balance between legitimacy and effectiveness required constant attention as the foundation grew and our operations became more visible. We developed boards of directors that included former law enforcement officials, legal experts, and victim advocates. We implemented financial oversight procedures that satisfied government auditors while protecting operational security. Most importantly, we maintained the core principles that had guided the network since its founding: protecting vulnerable people from those who would harm them, filling gaps where official systems failed, and maintaining ethical standards that distinguished us from the criminals we investigated. My role evolved again, from regional coordinator to executive director of the Southeastern Division, responsible for managing operations that employed over 40 people and influenced criminal justice policies across multiple states. The Victorian House became the official headquarters for the Foundation's Southeastern operations, with facilities that rivaled government agencies in their sophistication and capability. But personal relationships remained the most challenging aspect of the expanding responsibilities. Michael and I had been together for 3 years, and he'd proposed marriage, but the demands of my position made it difficult to plan for a conventional family life. "I want to build a life with you," he said during one of our rare quiet evenings at home. "But I also understand that your work requires sacrifices that most marriages couldn't survive. I need to know if you see a future where we can have both the relationship we want and the careers that matter to us." The question forced me to confront the same dilemma that had shaped grandmother's life and the lives of other senior network members. How do you balance personal happiness with responsibilities that affect thousands of people? How do you justify choosing individual fulfillment over collective service? "I want both," I admitted. "I want to marry you and maybe have children and build a normal life together. But I also can't abandon the work that gives my life meaning and purpose." "I'm not asking you to abandon the work. I'm asking if there's a way to structure the work so that it doesn't consume our entire existence." The conversation led to a year of careful planning and gradual transition that allowed me to step back from day-to-day operational management while maintaining strategic oversight of the Foundation's Southeastern Division. We hired additional coordinators who could handle routine surveillance operations, expanded our training programs to develop more senior staff, and created systems that allowed operations to continue effectively without requiring my constant personal involvement. Michael and I were married in the Victorian house's garden, with the ceremony performed by Margaret and attended by network members from around the country. It was a small wedding that honored both our commitment to each other and our shared dedication to protecting vulnerable people from those who would harm them. "Eleanor would have been delighted," Margaret told me during the reception. "She always regretted not allowing herself personal happiness, and she wanted the next generation of network leaders to find better balance between service and personal fulfillment." 6 months after our wedding, I discovered I was pregnant. The news brought joy and terror in equal measure. Joy at the prospect of starting a family with Michael. Terror at the prospect of bringing a child into a life that regularly involved danger and uncertainty. "Lots of network members have children," Linda Walsh assured me when I confided my fears about balancing parenthood with operational responsibilities. "It requires careful planning and enhanced security measures, but it's definitely possible to raise healthy, happy children while continuing the work." How do you protect children from the psychological impact of knowing their parents do dangerous work? "Age-appropriate honesty combined with comprehensive security," Linda replied. "Children are remarkably adaptable if they feel safe and loved. The key is making sure they understand that the work is important without burdening them with adult-level awareness of specific dangers." Our daughter Sarah was born on a snowy February morning, named for both grandmother's middle name and Michael's late mother. Holding her for the first time in the same Victorian house where I'd discovered my calling 9 years earlier, I felt the completion of a circle, the connected past, present, and future, in ways I was still learning to understand. The network had given me purpose, community, and the satisfaction of protecting innocent people from those who would harm them. Michael had given me love, emotional balance, and the courage to believe that personal happiness didn't require abandoning professional responsibility. Sarah represented the future, a new generation that would grow up knowing that ordinary people could do extraordinary things when they chose service over comfort. She's going to grow up understanding that her family fights monsters, I whispered to my sleeping daughter. But she's also going to understand that love is stronger than evil, and that someone's always watching to make sure the good people win. The Victorian house would continue to serve as headquarters for operations that protected thousands of people across multiple states. The hidden room in the basement would continue to house evidence of the network's growing influence and capability. But now it would also be home to a family that proved the network's members didn't have to choose between meaningful work and personal fulfillment. Grandmother's inheritance had evolved beyond anything she'd probably imagined when she first chose to fill gaps where official systems failed. But it remained true to the principles that had motivated her original decision: protecting innocent people, preventing preventable harm, and ensuring that someone was always watching when others looked away. The story continued, but now it included new chapters about raising a child who would understand from birth that her family's legacy involved standing between the innocent and those who would harm them. Sarah would grow up knowing that houses could hide secrets, that families could carry important responsibilities, and that love meant protecting others even when protection required sacrifice. The inheritance lived on, transformed but undiminished, in the hands of a new generation that would face new challenges while maintaining the eternal mission of watching so that others might live safely. The Victorian house stood ready for whatever came next, its elegant exterior hiding the sophisticated operations that had grown from one woman's determination to prevent tragedy. This was my inheritance, and now it was becoming Sarah's as well. This was my inheritance, and now it was becoming Sarah's as well. The first 2 years of motherhood challenged every assumption I'd made about balancing network responsibilities with personal life. Sarah was a healthy, curious baby who demanded attention at unpredictable hours, often coinciding with urgent operational needs that required immediate response. The Victorian house's nursery was equipped with security systems that rivaled government facilities, but no amount of technology could solve the fundamental problem of being needed in two places at once. "You're trying to do everything personally instead of trusting the systems you've built," Michael observed one evening as I paced the nursery holding Sarah while simultaneously reviewing case files on my tablet. "The network operated effectively before you became executive director. It can operate effectively while you focus on being a mother." He was right, but stepping back felt like abandoning responsibilities that affected real people's safety. During Sarah's first year, the Southeastern Division handled 43 active investigations, resulting in 27 arrests and the protection of over 150 potential victims. Each case represented someone's daughter, mother, sister, or child who was safer because of work I'd helped coordinate. "The guilt never goes away," Linda Walsh told me during one of our conversations about parenting within the network. "You feel guilty when you're working because you're not with your child, and you feel guilty when you're with your child because you're not protecting strangers who need help. Eventually, you learn to accept that you can't be perfect at everything." The solution came gradually through the development of what we called distributed leadership, spreading executive responsibilities among multiple coordinators rather than centralizing everything through a single director. Margaret took over day-to-day operational oversight, while I focused on strategic planning and coordination with law enforcement agencies. Other senior members assumed responsibility for training, financial management, and security coordination. "This is actually healthier for the organization," Margaret explained during one of our transition meetings. "Eleanor's mistake was trying to handle everything personally, which made the network vulnerable when she became ill. Having multiple people capable of managing critical functions makes us more resilient and sustainable." The distributed model also allowed me to work from home more frequently, conducting secure video conferences from the Victorian house while Sarah played in her specially designed playroom adjacent to my office. The house's sophisticated communication systems made it possible to coordinate complex operations without traveling constantly to regional meetings. But parenthood also heightened my awareness of the dangers that motivated our work. Reading case files about child abuse, domestic violence, and human trafficking took on new emotional intensity when I could look across the room and see my own vulnerable child. The abstract concept of protecting innocent people became visceral and personal in ways that sometimes made it difficult to maintain professional objectivity. You're experiencing what we call hypervigilance adaptation, Dr. Sarah Martinez explained during one of our therapy sessions. Becoming a parent activates psychological protective mechanisms that can enhance your effectiveness as an investigator, but can also lead to anxiety and emotional exhaustion if not properly managed. How do other network parents handle it? Different strategies work for different people. Some compartmentalize completely, maintaining strict separation between work concerns and family life. Others find that parenthood enhances their empathy and investigative instincts. The key is developing coping mechanisms that allow you to process difficult material without carrying it home emotionally. Quote, as Sarah approached her second birthday, she began displaying the kind of observational skills that seemed to run in our family. She noticed when people visited the house, remembered details about their appearances and behavior, and asked sophisticated questions about why adults sometimes seemed worried or sad. Mama, why do the people in the basement room look scared in the pictures? She asked one afternoon when she'd wandered into my office during a case review session. The question forced me to confront a dilemma I'd been avoiding. How much should Sarah know about the work that shaped our family's life? She was too young for detailed explanations, but she was also too observant to accept vague deflections indefinitely. Some people do things that hurt other people, I explained carefully. The people in those pictures are trying to help make sure the hurting stops. Are you one of the people who helps? Yes, sweetheart. Daddy and I both help people who are scared or hurt. Am I going to help people when I grow up? The innocence of the question highlighted the complexity of raising a child within the network. Sarah would grow up understanding that her family fought evil, but she would also grow up knowing that evil existed in ways that most children never had to consider. You can help people in whatever way feels right to you when you're older, I told her. There are lots of different ways to help people. Some people are doctors, some people are teachers, some people do the kind of work Mama and Daddy do. What kind of work do you do? We help make sure bad people can't hurt good people. Sarah seemed satisfied with this explanation, at least for the moment. But I knew the questions would become more complex as she grew older and became more aware of the unusual nature of our family's circumstances. The challenge of explaining our work became more pressing when Sarah started preschool and began interacting with children whose parents had conventional careers. Her teachers noted that she displayed unusual awareness of safety protocols and sometimes asked questions about strangers that suggested she'd been taught to be more cautious than typical preschoolers. Sarah asked me yesterday if I checked the playground for bad people before letting the children outside, reported Mrs. Johnson, her preschool teacher. When I asked what she meant by bad people, she said people who hurt children, and that her mommy always checks for them. Quote, Michael and I had to develop age-appropriate explanations for why our family took security precautions that other families didn't require. We talked about stranger safety and family protection without going into details about specific threats or ongoing investigations. We have to be more careful than some families because Mama and Daddy work with police officers to catch people who break laws, Michael explained to Sarah. That's why we have special locks on our house and why we always know where you are. Are the people who break laws dangerous? Some of them are, which is why we're careful. But remember that there are many more good people than bad people, and the good people work together to keep everyone safe. These conversations helped Sarah understand that our security measures were precautionary rather than reactive. We weren't hiding from immediate threats, but we were being appropriately careful because of the nature of our work. By Sarah's third birthday, the network had evolved into what was essentially a private intelligence agency specializing in cases that official law enforcement agencies couldn't or wouldn't handle effectively. The Victorian House served as the southeastern regional headquarters for operations that influenced policy at state and federal levels. But growth brought new challenges that tested our ability to maintain the ethical standards and operational security that had defined the network since its founding. Government agencies began expressing interest in formalizing partnerships that would provide them with access to our intelligence capabilities. Corporate clients offered lucrative contracts for services that would stretch our mission beyond protecting vulnerable individuals. "We're at a crossroads," Margaret explained during our annual strategic planning conference. "We can maintain our independence and focus on our original mission, or we can accept institutional partnerships that would provide resources and legitimacy at the cost of some autonomy." "What are the specific proposals?" "The FBI wants to establish a formal liaison program that would give us access to federal databases and communication systems in exchange for sharing our intelligence on organized crime and terrorism cases." Margaret spread documents across the conference table. "The Department of Justice is offering grants worth millions of dollars for expanding our services to include cybercrime and financial fraud investigations." Quote, "And the corporate offers? Insurance companies want us to investigate fraudulent claims. Law firms want evidence-gathering services for civil litigation. Security consulting firms want to subcontract surveillance operations they can't handle internally." Margaret's expression was carefully neutral. "The money is substantial, but the work would be very different from what we've always done." The discussion that followed revealed fundamental disagreements within network leadership about the organization's future direction. Some members believed that institutional partnerships would enhance our effectiveness and provide resources for expanding our mission. Others worried that government and corporate relationships would compromise our independence and distract us from protecting individual victims. "Eleanor founded this network to fill gaps where official systems failed," reminded Janet Rodriguez, one of the original watchers. "If we become part of those official systems, who's going to fill the gaps we currently fill? But if we don't evolve with the changing landscape, we risk becoming irrelevant," countered Dr. Amanda Walsh. "Criminal organizations are becoming more sophisticated, using technology and international networks that individual surveillance operations can't effectively counter." The debate continued for months, with different regions of the network reaching different conclusions about how to balance independence with institutional cooperation. Some divisions accepted federal partnerships and expanded into cybercrime and terrorism investigations. Others maintained traditional focus on individual victim protection and community-level surveillance. The Southeastern Division, under my leadership, chose a middle path that maintained operational independence while accepting limited cooperation with law enforcement agencies on cases that aligned with our core mission. We developed formal protocols for sharing intelligence with the FBI and state agencies, but we retained the right to refuse collaboration on cases that didn't serve vulnerable populations. This approach allows us to benefit from institutional resources without surrendering our ability to investigate cases that government agencies might consider politically sensitive or resource-intensive, I explained to the Network Leadership Council. The decision proved prescient when we uncovered a human trafficking network that involved elected officials and law enforcement personnel in 3 states. Our independent status allowed us to investigate corruption that federal agencies couldn't address due to political constraints and institutional relationships. If we'd been formally partnered with federal agencies, we never could have investigated the trafficking network, Margaret observed after the case resulted in 43 arrests and the rescue of over 70 victims. Our independence is what allows us to go where official investigations can't. But independence came with ongoing costs that affected every aspect of our operations. We remained targets for criminal organizations that saw us as threats to their activities. We faced constant pressure from government agencies that wanted access to our intelligence capabilities. We struggled with funding challenges that limited our ability to expand operations or improve security measures. Most personally challenging was the impact on family life as Sarah grew older and became more aware of the unusual nature of our circumstances. By age 4, she understood that our house was different from other houses, that her parents did work that other parents didn't do, and that her family took security precautions that other families didn't require. "Why can't I have sleepovers at other kids' houses?" she asked one evening after being told she couldn't attend a classmate's birthday party sleepover. "Because we need to know where you are at all times," Michael explained. "It's not because we don't trust you or because you've done anything wrong. It's because Mama and Daddy's work means we have to be extra careful about safety." Do other kids' parents do work like yours? Most parents don't do exactly the same work we do, but all parents work to take care of their families and help other people in different ways. Sarah's questions became more sophisticated as she entered kindergarten and began comparing her family's lifestyle to those of her classmates. She noticed that other children could participate in activities that required advanced planning and overnight trips. She observed that other parents didn't have offices with multiple computer screens and communication equipment. "I want to have friends over to play," she announced one Saturday morning. "Emma's mom said she could come to our house, but you have to call and talk to her about, quote, security protocols." The phrase security protocols in a 5-year-old's vocabulary highlighted how our work environment was shaping Sarah's understanding of normal social interactions. Even innocent childhood activities required background checks and safety procedures that most families never had to consider. "We can definitely have Emma over to play," I assured Sarah. "We just need to make sure her parents understand that our house has some special rules about where children can play and which rooms they can visit." "Because of the basement room with all the pictures?" The question caught me off guard. Sarah had been in my office hundreds of times, but I thought I'd been careful about limiting her access to sensitive materials. "How do you know about the pictures in the basement?" "I saw them when you left your computer on. There are lots of pictures of people who look scared or hurt." Sarah's voice was matter of fact, without fear or distress. "Are those the people you help?" The moment had arrived earlier than I'd anticipated. Sarah was old enough to ask direct questions about our work, but still young enough that the answers could shape her psychological development in fundamental ways. "Some of those people are people we've helped," I said carefully. "Others are people we're trying to help. And some are people we're watching to make sure they don't hurt anyone else." "Are you like police officers?" "We work with police officers, but we do different kinds of work. Police officers arrest people who have already hurt someone. We try to figure out who might hurt someone so we can prevent it from happening." "That's good work," Sarah said with the definitive judgment of childhood. "I want to do that work too when I grow up." The conversation continued over the following weeks as Sarah processed what she'd learned about our family's mission. Her questions revealed a sophisticated understanding of good and evil, justice and protection that exceeded what most kindergartners demonstrated. But her acceptance of our work as normal and necessary also suggested that she was developing psychological frameworks that could either prepare her for meaningful service or burden her with premature awareness of human darkness. As I watched my daughter sleep peacefully in her bed, surrounded by the security systems and hidden cameras that protected our Victorian fortress, I realized that grandmother's inheritance had become something far more complex than a house full of secrets. It was a legacy that demanded difficult choices from each generation. How much truth to reveal, how much innocence to preserve, how much responsibility to pass on to those who never asked for it. Sarah would grow up knowing that evil existed and that her family stood against it. Whether that knowledge would make her stronger or steal something precious from her childhood remained to be seen. But as I turned off the lights in her room and walked through halls lined with surveillance monitors, I knew that some inheritances couldn't be refused, only embraced or abandoned. The choice would be hers to make when she was old enough to understand what it truly meant. Until then, we would continue watching, protecting and fighting the battles that allowed children like her to sleep safely in houses that hid the work of keeping monsters at bay. The Victorian house held our secrets, but it also held our purpose, and that, I realized, was the most important inheritance of all.